My name's Curran. I'm from BrokenHill. Pardon me. I've lived here for about 20 years. I'm a semi-retired veterinarian and an epidemiologist. I've worked on a number of issues that I think relate to the Tribunal's interests. For a period, I was the Wildlife Disease Coordinator for New South Wales. I was also, I suppose, I worked over most of Western New South Wales as a veterinarian looking at sheep, cattle, goat and wildlife problems, and before that I worked in Northern South Australia dealing with brucellosis and tuberculosis. I've realised that I suppose the climate, the importance of rainfall affects the whole system, and in looking at problems like blue-green algal blooms that affect, I suppose, both the river and livestock that might be using those waters, I needed to try and understand what was going on. So I suppose for a period of time I've been looking at the patterning of not only rainfall but temperature and evaporation rates. And I suppose I'll just run through a number of issues that I believe is important. I suppose firstly, I believe that the Darling River is essentially dysfunctional. It's not working as it should. And the fish kills, which we've looked at over time, the blue-green algal blooms, symptoms of that dysfunction. The solutions to that problem of dysfunction are really complex. I've been concerned that our governments are probably not competent to deal with those problems. They need to commit themselves to dealing with that problem, firstly, which I don't believe they have. They need to understand the causes of that dysfunction, which I don't believe they have. To me, I suppose we've seen two reports recently, one by the Academy of Science and one by the Minister for Regional Waters group. The report by the Australian Academy of Science is far superior, and looking at the material they've been able to pull together in a relatively short period of time, I believe that group of people have got some of the core competencies that are essential. So I believe the government needs to recognise the value and importance of that report from the Australian Academy of Sciences, just as a first point. Now, this is jumping a little, but I believe it's important for the Tribunal to appreciate that the Minister for Regional Water has largely supplanted and usurped the Minister for Environment and Heritage. The Minister for Environment and Heritage has not begun to engage with the issues of the environment that are at the heart of the problems that are facing the Darling. I believe the Premier of the state needs to direct the Minister for Environment and Heritage to take charge of the situation and work with the Minister for Regional Water, for Primary Industries and Trade and Investment. I suppose I really see it as the Minister that's essentially responsible for caring for the river and the environment, working with the Minister that's in charge of exploiting the river and the environment. Whether or not the politicians see that issue that way is entirely up to the politicians, but that's my view. It's a really complex issue, and I don't have any ready recommendations for it. It's extraordinarily complex to be able to try and pull together those issues of exploitation and caring that go to the heart of it. It's a whole of the community problem, and I believe that, as we've heard other speakers, the government needs to acknowledge community concerns and try and pull it all together. You know, that's their job as politicians. But they need good science. They need, I suppose, a good heart and good intent, the right sort of motivation to deal with it. And we've heard concerns about that. Okay. The other area that I'd like to talk about comes from work that I've been doing looking at the patterning of rainfall and evaporation and temperature. I suppose firstly, looking at, I've looked at both monthly and daily rainfall for, I've looked at daily rainfall for places like the Longreach area and far northwestern New South Wales. And you may not appreciate it, but it's possible to determine when wetter and drier periods start and end, and they start and end on single days. And that's quite extraordinary. In this part of the world, in northwestern New South Wales, we can move from an arid to a semi-arid climate on a day. That's the way the system works. And equally, we'll move from semi-arid to arid on a day. Looking at this part of the world, looking at 140 years of rainfall records, we can see that on average, those drier periods last for 3.3 years. The wetter periods last for an average of 1.6. There's enormous range around that, as you can imagine. But using averages, I think we could, all right, if we use averages, the expectation is that this current drier period, which started in February 2017, will end in May 2020. So we've got some time now before we're going to have some opportunity to deal with a wetter period and all the many opportunities that they present in terms of both the Darling and the area around it. The wetter periods, because they're shorter, 1.6 years on average, we really need to identify when they start, and we need to work hard at using, I suppose, the opportunities that rain brings and our knowledge that they're not going to last, well, they're going to last for a certain period of time to factor in what we do in managing that whole system. Righto. Looking at the other work that I've done, okay, so that essential feature of how rainfall works applies across Australia. So we move from wetter to drier episodes on a day across Australia. The timing varies according to where you are, but there are relationships across Australia. I've offered the first of those papers to the Rangelands Journal, and as I've understood it, they've accepted that paper provided I look at analysing that patterning in terms of things like the SOI and the Indian Ocean Dipole, which I'm working on at the moment. So once I've done that work, we'll start to be able to better predict when those wetter and drier periods start and end. Now, in terms of climate change, I think there are two things that really stand out. So I've analysed evaporation rates not only for this part of the world, the Murray-Darling Basin, the Darling Basin, but I've looked at other sites as well, and evaporation rates have increased quite markedly. On average, it's about 30%, and that's over, I suppose, really 20-year periods. I've used Foley's method. But in some areas, particularly this part of the world, the evaporation rates have gone up by up to 100 to 120%. So that's something that we need to understand. that understanding applies to the whole of this basin. So one of the things that climate change will bring will be an increase in evaporation. In terms of temperature, using Foley's methods, the rate of increase in temperatures also act, I suppose, in terms of state and transition. So you'll have periods where things are wetter or warmer or cooler, but overall everything's moving upwards. But we need to understand, I suppose, how those warmer and cooler periods occur and how they're increasing. But if you take that into account, the rate of increase in temperatures is greater than the 1 degree to 1.5 degrees that we've been told about. If you analyse it using Foley's methods, the increase is about 2 to 2.5 degrees over the last 20 years. Looking at Sydney's rainfall, not only rainfall but the temperature records, you can start to see what's happening more generally, and you can see that the changes in temperature aren't simple. And I think, again, we need to understand that to be able to properly manage this system. Okay, so we've got just a few minutes left. Okay.
Please continue. I was just going to ask, with all that very impressive work you've done on looking at the evaporation and climate change and temperature issues, how do you see that as being important to factor into the water management issues here? Have you got specific recommendations?
I suppose the specific recommendations is that whatever work is done to manage the Darling needs to factor those changes. It's also going to be important to understand how those changes affect the land around the Darling system. That increase in temperature, increase in evaporation is affecting the whole basin. I suppose I've also been I've been doing data logging of ground temperatures and relative humidities. And what we're seeing is that the ground temperatures are increasing more rapidly, and this has been backed up by the head of research of Bureau of Meteorology. For every 1 degree increase in air temperatures, the ground temperatures will go up between 10 and 15 degrees. Now that's extraordinary. So in this part of the world, when you measure ground temperatures, the average maximum in this part of the world through summer, so this is October through to March, is 70 degrees. Now that is quite astonishing, right? It's between 60 and 70, depending where you are, whether you're in shade or not. But that, we'll see just this extraordinary increase in ground temperatures, which is going to affect a number of things. It'll increase evaporation rates. It's going to decrease plant growth. The denuding of the environment is going to actually increase water flows off, but they're going to be in a rush. It'll increase the dust as well. So we've got a whole complex of factors that need to be taken into account. We're going, there's the chance of something really drastic happening over the next 10 to 20 years, far more rapidly than we can really understand. We need to look at the last 20 years, though, to try and understand what's going to happen over the next 10 to 50 years.
Many people say that the current government at either state or federal level aren't really factoring in climate change sufficiently. What would you say to that claim? Do you think that's true?
Yes, it's political. I suppose I'm quite interested in that, but the National Party does seem to be driving the agenda, and the people that the National Party represent are unfairly influencing that whole debate. The question of climate change hasn't been addressed in Australian discourse.
Can I just ask one final question before I see if the panellists have a question? Just referring back to your professional work as an epidemiologist, with the work you've been doing with wildlife and as in a vet capacity, have you seen significant changes over the last few decades in the kind of the health of
Yes. I suppose the most drastic are things like the fish kills, but the other issues that I've seen, there's one that's really well documented. So Professor Richard Kingsford has been able to demonstrate the marked decline in bird populations across the landscape. He's seen that, he spoke here in BrokenHill actually, it would have been over over about a 20-year period. So that's been something that, fits in well. It's my understanding that, at least some of that decline goes back to the increase in temperatures. So birds and animals like sheep are acutely sensitive to increased temperatures. If you start to think about animals being exposed to ground temperatures of 60 to 70 degrees, you can start to understand, we've got no real appreciation of what animals are really feeling. So that's one issue. The other is, I suppose, the major issue I've seen are the massive kangaroo die-offs that have been occurring. So, oddly enough, those big die-offs begin with increases in kangaroo populations. But when you get high densities of kangaroos, you start to see those die-offs begin. And I suppose the die-offs that we've been looking at, I've estimated that in Western New South Wales alone we've lost about 3 million roos due to that die-off. Those die-offs are related to climate and climate change. Okay.
And over the last few years, with the declining and poor water quality in the river systems, I mean, it's obvious that animals die when there's no water, but what about the quality of the water that's left? We're hearing different stories that it's kind of smellier and yuckier than it used to be. Yeah, do you see that over kind of a multi-year trend?
Yes, it is. So I suppose I've worked in this part of the world for over 20 years, and I suppose in North and South Australia before that. I've had a chance to fly over a fair bit of it too. The river system has deteriorated in that period of time. If you talk to some of the old graziers, that have been around for 30 to 50 years living on the Darling, when they talk about the Darling in early years, it was just completely different. They could see to the bottom of the river. It was just clear. They could see, green vegetation. They could see fish moving through it. It was just completely different. Now, you fellas will know better than I what the Darling looks like now, but it's nothing like that now. Now, I suppose the other thing, in terms of epidemiology, when you're seeing big blue-green algal blooms, it means that there's a very high level of organic material in the water, and that represents dysfunction. The river isn't working as it should when you've got that amount of organic, basically loose organic matter. With a proper ecological system, that organic matter should be bound up and used to turn out, I suppose, vegetation and fish. When you've got turbid water, what happens? It just doesn't work. So I think we know that the river can work better than it does now, but how we go about that is something quite different. The scientists, though, people like Richard Kingsford, the other people that have put superb work into that Academy of Science report, need to be involved. It was interesting, while Richard was here, I asked him a question from the floor. Why aren't the politicians listening to you? And this was, the Fowler's Gap Forum, University of New South Wales. He said, well, they're not. That was 2 years ago, and I hope that they start to listen to him and people of his standing and understanding.
But I think anyone who's aware of what's been going on in the politics lately, it's wisdom, Indigenous wisdom, local wisdom, scientific knowledge. Those issues sit to the side when other political debates happen. So it's not that the common folk don't respect this information, it's that those pieces of information.
Yeah, we're suffering from a lack of leadership, yeah. So, look, just Okay, so look, I suppose just in general terms, we need better leaders. Jacinda Ardern has just been a revelation. But we also need to address climate change.